Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, we rediving into a curious topic, those rare moments when the dark forces in the world of Harry Potter actually outsmarted the light side. Yes, Voldemort, the terror of the wizarding world, the great villain whose name people feared to speak, but calling him a strategic genius would be a stretch. His loud victories were often followed by mistakes, and his followers, well, let's be honest, many of them couldn't even outwit school children. And yet there were times when the Dark Lord and his servants did manage to trick the heroes, pushing them into missteps, suffering, and tragic losses. Today we revisit those very moments. Make yourself comfortable. Let us begin. Number 1. Isolating Harry. One of the quietest yet most powerful blows against Harry was the Ministry, its campaign in Order of the Phoenix. Using newspapers and propaganda, Fudge and his people painted Harry as practically insane, a boy who supposedly made up Voldemort return. The irony is that Voldemort did want his return revealed, and the Ministry basically did all the work for him by aggressively spreading lies. Harry became isolated, distanced from students, and even from friends he trusted. The psychological blow was far more painful than any spell. Number 2. The false vision. One of Voldemort's craftiest tricks was exploiting the mental link between him and Harry. Once he realized the boy could see glimpses of his thoughts, the Dark Lord decided to use it. He fed Harry a false vision of Sirius supposedly being tortured. Naturally, Harry rushed to save his godfather and walked straight into Voldemort's trap. We all know the outcome. Sirius died and Harry barely survived. The plan was simple, brutal, and extremely effective. Number 3. Draco and the Vanishing Cabinet. Book 6 tells the story of how Draco Malfoy, often dismissed as a spoiled child, pulled off one of the most serious breaches of Hogwarts security. He repaired the Vanishing Cabinet and linked it to the one in Borgin and Berks. The result? The Death Eaters gained direct access to the castle, bypassing all the protections and enchantments, even the ones known only to Dumbledore and McGonagall. Draco may have been terrified and conflicted, but technically he accomplished the impossible. He opened a door into Hogwarts no one even imagined existed before. Bathilda Bagshot. In Godric's Hollow, Voldemort set one of his darkest traps. In the house where Harry hoped to find traces of his past, Nagini was waiting, disguised inside Bathilda Bagshot, as corpse. The trick was chillingly clever, where Bathilda spoke to Harry privately in parcel tongue, which Hermione wouldn't understand. The disguise was flawless, and the trap nearly succeeded. Only Hermione's quick reaction saved them both. Number 5. Pettigrew's Long Game. Peter Pettigrew is a complicated character, weak, cowardly, yet surprisingly inventive when his survival was at stake. Not only did he betray his friends, but he staged his own death, making it look like Sirius murdered him. All blame fell on Black, while Pettigrew, using his animagus form, quietly moved in with the Weasleys as a rat. For years he stayed hidden, lived off others, gathered information, and waited for his master's return. A perfect hiding place. Number 6. The Cup as a Portkey. The finale of the Triwizard Tournament shocked both Harry and the readers. The cup had been turned into a portkey that transported Harry and Cedric straight into the hands of Wormtail and the resurrecting Voldemort. Yes, the plan was overly elaborate. Fans still debate why Voldemort needed the entire tournament. But the outcome is what matters. The trick worked. Harry was alone, unprotected, face to face with his enemies. And if not for a chain of unlikely events, the story might have ended very differently. Number 7, Yaxley and the Sabotaged Apparition. The escape from the Ministry took an unexpected turn when Yaxley grabbed Hermione's arm at the moment of apparition. Because of this, Ron was seriously injured, and the trio ended up far from where they planned. This small moment mattered a lot. Hermione had to save Ron, adjust their plans, and stay hidden much longer than expected. Not the cleverest scheme, but a lucky break for a villain that put the heroes in real danger. Number 8, Umbridge and the Ban on Magic. Dolores Umbridge entered Hogwarts wrapped in pink, but every ribbon hid a blade. Her decree banning practical defense against the dark arts was not foolishness, it was strategy. "You will not require spells in my class," she chirped, tapping her clipboard. The students stared in disbelief. Harry protested that Voldemort had returned, but Umbridge smiled sweetly and called it delusional misbehavior. With a single educational decree, she turned an entire generation of witches and wizards into observers instead of defenders. She wasn't teaching. She was disarming them. Her influence seeped deeper each week. She inspected teachers, she silenced dissent, she intercepted mail. Every tactic weakened Hogwarts from the inside, leaving its students unprepared for the war approaching their gates. Even McGonagall admitted, the Ministry is interfering at a dangerous level. Umbridge was no Death Eater, but her methods served Voldemort perfectly. By stripping the school of knowledge and hope, she did what curses could not. She made Hogwarts vulnerable. Number 9, the death of Alastor Moody. The night of the 7 Potters was meant to be flawless. Moody barked orders. Hagrid readied the motorbike. 6 decoys transformed into copies of Harry. But the moment they lifted off, the sky erupted. They knew I was the real one!" Harry shouted as curses sliced through the darkness. The ambush was too precise to be luck. Someone had leaked the plan, and Voldemort's followers were waiting, hungry for blood. Amid the chaos, Alastor, Mad-Eye, Moody fought like the legend he was. He hurled spells with brutal accuracy, covering the escape of others, yet even he couldn't survive a trap designed by spies. A killing curse struck him mid-flight. He fell into the night, swallowed by the storm clouds. The Order felt the loss instantly. Moody was their shield, their watchtower, and he was gone in seconds. It was the first victory of Voldemort's campaign. Clean, swift, devastating. When the survivors regrouped at the burrow, fear crawled into the room with them. "Who betrayed us?" someone whispered. No one answered. No one could. That silence became another weapon. Distrust cracked the Order from within, shaking their unity long before Voldemort struck again. The Death Eaters had done more than kill Moody. They had poisoned the air the heroes breathed. And Voldemort, watching from the shadows, knew the battle was already tilting in his favor. Number 10, Gringotts and the Fake Sword. Harry, Ron, and Hermione truly believed the sword of Gryffindor they saw in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault was the real thing. They clung to that hope like a lifeline. A weapon that could destroy Horcruxes meant a chance to end Voldemort's reign. But the goblins and Death Eaters were a step ahead. They had already replaced the sword with a flawless fake. When Harry stared at it among Bellatrix's treasures, the metal glimmered with the promise of victory. In truth, it was nothing more than a decoy. The danger of that deception was enormous. Hermione whispered, "If this is real, we can destroy the cup." Yet nothing would have happened. A fake sword could not absorb basilisk venom. It could break. It could fail. And in a vault designed to duplicate objects endlessly, the illusion became even more convincing. The trio planned, dreamed, and risked everything while trusting a blade that held no magic at all. The villains had turned hope into a trap. Only when the real sword appeared in their tent, glowing where Snape had left it, did the truth finally strike. Ron lifted it with both hands, stunned, realizing what they had escaped. The trio had been wandering the countryside with a useless copy, unaware how close they were to disaster. Until that moment, the Death Eaters had quietly outplayed them, staying one deadly step ahead. Number 11, the Marauder's map used against Harry. Draco Malfoy learned early in the year that Harry Potter relied on the Marauder's map the way other students relied on hallways. Harry checked it constantly. He searched for Draco's name. He followed his movements. In Half-Blood Prince, this obsession became predictable. Draco understood the pattern and used it. "Potter's always watching me," he muttered once in frustration, but instead of running, he vanished, slipping into the one place the map could never reveal. The room of requirement hid him like a second skin. Harry stared at the map night after night and saw nothing but an empty corridor. Draco's name never appeared. The silence mocked him. Meanwhile, behind one enchanted door, Draco repaired the vanishing cabinet piece by piece. He brought in birds to test the passage. He listened to their frantic wings. He waited for the moment when one would return alive. All the while, Harry paced with the map in his hands, certain Draco was somewhere just out of sight. The tension finally snapped during one of Harry's late-night patrols. He whispered, "Show yourself, Malfoy," but the ink stayed still. The map gave him nothing. Draco's strategy was working so well that even Ron doubted Harry's suspicions. It felt like a chessboard where one player thought 3 moves ahead and the other kept checking the same square. Draco wasn't stronger, he wasn't braver, but at that moment he was smarter. By the time Harry forced his way into the bathroom confrontation, the damage was done. The cabinet was nearly fixed. The plan was almost complete. Draco had beaten Harry with Harry's own tool by simply stepping outside the boundaries of the map. It was a quiet victory, achieved without duels or curses, just clever thinking and an understanding of his rival's weaknesses. For a short time, Draco played the board better, and Hogwarts would soon pay the price. Number 12, Narcissa and the Lie About Harry's Death. Narcissa Malfoy stepped into the Forbidden Forest with one purpose. She had to know if her son was alive. Voldemort watched her closely as she knelt beside Harry's body. Her hand trembled as she touched his face. In that quiet moment, she whispered, "Is Draco alive?" Harry felt her breath against his cheek and answered with the faintest whisper, "Yes." Narcissa closed her eyes. Relief washed through her. She now had the truth she needed, truth Voldemort could never give her. She rose to her feet slowly. Harry felt her grip tighten just once, a silent pact born in darkness. Voldemort demanded an answer. Every Death Eater listened. Narcissa looked at the man she feared and lied with perfect calm. "He is dead." Those words moved like a cold wind through the trees. Voldemort smiled. The Death Eaters roared. The lie spread instantly, and no one questioned it, not even the Dark Lord who trusted her loyalty more than her love for Draco. The beauty of her deception was in its subtlety. No spell, no battle, no dramatic gesture, just a mother making a choice that changed the fate of the war. By declaring Harry dead, Narcissa allowed Voldemort's army to relax. They lowered their guard. They marched toward Hogwarts, believing victory was complete. Even Harry, carried like a trophy, felt the strategy forming around him. Narcissa had turned the battlefield into a stage, and every villain played their part without knowing it. When Harry leapt from Hagrid's arms moments later, the illusion shattered. The defenders of Hogwarts surged forward with renewed fury. Chaos exploded. Voldemort stumbled, blindsided by the betrayal within his own ranks. Narcissa, Islai, had bought the heroes the single advantage they needed: surprise. She served no cause but Draco. Yet for a few crucial minutes, she outwitted the greatest dark wizard alive, and every hero stood powerless beneath her quiet genius. Number 13, Lucius Malfoy and Riddle, is diary. Lucius Malfoy never raised his wand in Diagon Alley. He didn't need to. His weapon fit neatly inside a second-hand transfiguration book. When he slipped Tom Riddle's diary into Ginny Weasley's cauldron, it looked like nothing more than a petty insult. A pure-blood aristocrat humiliating a poor family. But Lucius had a larger game in mind. "Arthur Weasley has been interfering at the Ministry far too long," he once hissed. By planting the diary on Arthur, daughter, he hoped to cause a scandal that would weaken both Arthur and Dumbledore in one move. Ginny never suspected the danger. The diary whispered to her gently. It felt safe, friendly. "My name is Tom Riddle," the ink wrote back. His neat handwriting soothed her fears and fed her loneliness. Meanwhile, Lucius watched from afar, smiling at the chaos he had quietly engineered. He believed he had done nothing magical at all, just a misplaced book, just a child who was too careless to notice. Yet every attack on Muggle-born students began with his silent act. The Chamber of Secrets opened. The monster walked again. Hogwarts trembled with fear. In those moments, Lucius's plan seemed to work perfectly. Dumbledore was removed. Arthur Weasley was accused. The Ministry scrambled to assign blame. Lucius had created a storm without ever stepping inside the castle, and still he had no idea the diary was a Horcrux. He only sensed its power, its potential to ruin reputations and shift influence at the Ministry in his favor. When Harry finally confronted him in Dumbledore's office, Lucius's mask cracked for a second. Dobby stepped between them. The diary lay exposed, ruined. Harry looked straight into Malfoy's eyes and said softly, "You didn't know what you were doing, Lucius." Silence confirmed it. He had unleashed one of Voldemort's darkest creations without understanding its true nature, but intent didn't matter. For a brief, frightening time, the victory belonged to him. Number 14, Slughorn and the Tampered Memory. In Half-Blood Prince, Horace Slughorn tries to hide a moment he wishes had never happened. Years earlier, Tom Riddle asked him about Horcruxes. Slughorn, Ed's answer, careless, indulgent, almost proud, helped the young Slytherin prodigy shape his darkest ambition. Terrified of being blamed, Slughorn didn't just avoid the truth, he rewrote it. He took a memory and reshaped it like soft wax, cutting out the most dangerous lines. In the altered scene, Slughorn looks cautious, wise, almost frightened, but Dumbledore immediately senses the lie. "This is a very poor memory," he tells Harry. "The worst I have ever seen. Harry needs the original memory. Without it, Dumbledore can't understand how many Horcruxes Voldemort made. The entire hunt is at risk, but Slughorn won't yield. He dodges, he flatters, he drinks. He insists that Tom Riddle wasn't interested in anything improper." He hides behind guilt, telling Harry, "I don't do shame very well." For a time, the truth seems unreachable. Slughorn's private fear becomes a shield, stronger than any charm. The turning point comes one quiet night in the potions classroom. Felix Felicis runs warm through Harry's veins, guiding him with soft confidence. Slughorn relaxes under the glow of a blooming tentacular plant and a bottle of mead. The walls he built around the truth loosen. Harry pushes gently. He speaks of his mother, Lily, whom Slughorn adored. "She sacrificed herself for me," Harry says. "Don't make her death meaningless." Slughorn trembles. His disguise of cheerfulness cracks. The memory he has guarded for decades comes free. The restored scene is devastating. Riddle's voice is smooth as glass. "Isn't it true, sir, that one split of the soul makes a Horcrux?" Slughorn, flushed with pride, whispers back, "7, Tom. 7 would be the most stable." That single whisper becomes the key that unlocks Voldemort's secret immortality. Slughorn never meant to serve the darkness, but for a long, dangerous stretch of time, his fear did exactly that, and the heroes could do nothing but wait, powerless, until the truth was finally spoken. Number 15, the Lestrange Vault and the Trap at the Bank. When the trio descended into the depths of Gringotts, they believed they were relying on their greatest asset, quick thinking, flawless disguises, and the audacity that had carried them through countless dangers. Yet hidden in the stone corridors of the bank was a truth that would reveal itself far too late. The Lestranges, masters of cruelty and manipulation, had crafted a trap so intricate that even Gringotts, with its ancient traditions and ironclad independence, bent beneath their influence. The vault of Bellatrix Lestrange was more than a storeroom of dark treasures. It was the beating heart of a maze constructed to snap shut the instant anyone dared approach. Hermione's Polyjuice disguise as Bellatrix seemed convincing from the outset, but cracks appeared before they even reached security. Goblin eyes narrowed, whispers surged, and the sense of being watched became inescapable. The real Bellatrix had already sent warnings to the bank. Her panic after discovering that her vault had been tampered with transforming into a fury that consumed every goblin who crossed her path. In Deathly Hallows, the urgency of her alarm echoes through the words, "She knows, Harry, she knows the sword is gone." That single realization made her vault the most dangerous place in the bank. Every guard, every enchantment, and every goblin had been instructed to react with force to even the slightest inconsistency. Gringotts had always been a realm where goblin authority overshadowed wizard arrogance. Yet, during the Second Wizarding War, the Lestranges managed to twist that authority to their will. Their partnership with several high-ranking goblins was not built on respect but on fear, magical coercion, and the kind of manipulation that promised swift destruction for any who stood against them. In their eyes, Bellatrix was not merely a wealthy pureblood aristocrat, but Voldemort's most unpredictable weapon. Her command alone was enough for the goblins to weave layers of defensive enchantments never previously used for any private client. Once inside, the trio realized too late that the Lestrange vault was designed not for preservation, but for entrapment. The multiplying treasure, the cursed surfaces, and the temperature rising with every touch were not accidents of old goblin magic, but results of recent enhancements. These measures had been strengthened after Bellatrix's terror-driven outburst, ensuring that any intruding hand would ignite a chain reaction. The book chillingly notes how the objects began, burning hot and multiplying, turning the vault into a shimmering inferno. Harry, Hermione, and Ron were buried under a metallic flood that threatened to crush and consume them. The goblins outside the vault were not acting of their own free will. Their fear of Voldemort had reached an unprecedented height, especially after rumors circulated that he could enter their minds the same way he terrorized his followers. The Lestranges fed this fear carefully, letting it ferment until panic became obedience. When the trio's illusion wavered for the briefest moment, the goblins reacted with the precision of soldiers trained to anticipate treachery. The clang of armor, the shouts calling for reinforcements, and the sparks of defensive spells against them revealed how expertly the Lestranges had laid their trap. For Harry, the greatest danger was not the goblin guards, but the psychological shadow of Bellatrix herself. Her presence clung to the vault like a stain, a reminder of a witch whose cruelty left scars deeper than dark magic. Her scream during the discovery that her vault might have been violated had become a commandment haunting the goblins. The book hints at her panic with the line, "She is terrified. She thinks it's her fault." That terror turned into an obsessive fixation on ensuring no one would ever touch her possessions again. The very air inside the vault felt tainted by her paranoia. The trio's use of illusions and transfiguration was brilliant, but temporary. Hermione's attempt at imitating Bellatrix faltered under pressure, her hesitance betraying the truth behind the disguise. Ron's quick efforts to manipulate the goblins, expectations strained under the weight of their suspicion. Even Harry's desperate reliance on the imperious curse, something he never imagined himself casting, was not enough to grant lasting safety. The Lestranges had set up a web where illusions could hide the intruders for minutes, but never for an hour. The moment the vault doors clanged behind them, sealing them inside, it became clear that they had walked into a cage, not a storeroom. Enchantments hidden in the walls activated one by one, their layered complexity proof of goblin craftsmanship strengthened by Lestrange influence. It was not a system designed for ordinary thieves, it was a system designed for war. The expanding treasures, the rising heat, and the shimmering haze all served one purpose: to trap intruders until reinforcements, wizard or goblin, could arrive to deal with them permanently. Yet the most dangerous element of the trap was not magical at all, it was psychological. The trio could hear the distant rumble of goblin voices, the echo of armored boots, and the metallic groan of machinery designed to lock down the entire wing of the bank. Panic threatened to override strategy. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with the awareness that no one had ever escaped such a scenario. The Lestranges understood fear better than anyone, and they weaponized it as expertly as they wielded wands. When the trio finally broke free of the vault, what awaited them was not liberation, but a battalion of goblins ready to strike. Every face bore the imprint of terror, fear of Voldemort, fear of Bellatrix, fear of failure. Their spells crackled through the air, illuminating the marble with violent whirls of light. The Lestranges had achieved something no wizard had accomplished before. They had turned Gringotts into a battlefield, bending the institution's pride into a tool for their dark agenda. Number 16, Voldemort, Resurrection Ritual. The night in the little Hangleton graveyard stands as one of the most unsettling examples of how villains in the wizarding world managed to outwit the heroes by preparing a trap with almost ritualistic precision. Everything that happened there was not chaos, not improvisation, not sudden opportunity. It was the execution of a long, carefully constructed plan. Peter Pettigrew, who for years had lived as a rat in the shadows, emerged as the mastermind behind a rebirth engineered through fear, devotion, and calculation. His trembling loyalty to Lord Voldemort was mixed with a desperate need to prove he had not abandoned his master. That desperation shaped a ritual where every detail mattered, and where Harry Potter himself unknowingly became the final key in the Dark Lord, his resurrection. For many, Pettigrew had always seemed a coward rather than a strategist. Yet this single event demonstrated how deeply heroism can underestimate fear-driven loyalty. When Voldemort whispered from the body he inhabited, a frail mixture of magic and parasitic life, that his servant must do the deed, Pettigrew obeyed with a devotion Harry had never imagined him capable of. Years earlier, this same man had betrayed James and Lily Potter, providing Voldemort with the very information that sealed their fate. Now, in a cruel symmetry, Pettigrew returned to the grave of Tom Riddle Sr., the man Voldemort despised, to commit another act of betrayal, this time against the boundaries of life itself. The ritual chosen for Voldemort's rebirth was not a simple spell, but an ancient piece of dark magic crafted around three symbolic offerings: blood, bone, and flesh. It reflected Voldemort's own twisted philosophy that power must be taken by force and sacrifice, not granted by destiny. Each component had meaning, each demanded precision. Pettigrew's task started long before the graveyard. He needed to capture Harry, the one person Voldemort believed could both restore and empower him. Harry's blood symbolized the victory Voldemort once failed to claim. As the Dark Lord later boasted Harry carried, "The protection my mother left in your veins," and Voldemort wanted to twist that protection into his own armor. It was not enough to live again. He wanted to return better, stronger, invulnerable to what had once destroyed him. The choice of location elevated the ritual into an act of revenge. Tom Riddle Sr.'s grave was a place Voldemort avoided in life but embraced in undeath. His hatred for his father was matched only by the contempt he felt for his Muggle origins. By using the bone of the father he loathed, Voldemort anchored his new body in a rejection of his past. Pettigrew, shivering and terrified, dug into the earth to retrieve that bone. It was an act he performed not out of loyalty, but from an understanding that failure meant death. The graveyard, silent and cold, became a battleground where good had no chance to intervene. Voldemort's enemies did not even know the ritual existed. Harry, trapped and disarmed, became the centerpiece of the ceremony. Pettigrew's knife cut into his arm, collecting the blood that Voldemort believed would solve his greatest weakness. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the chilling line, "Blood of the enemy," forcibly taken, "You will resurrect your foe," revealed the ancient nature of the spell. Voldemort believed that by taking Harry's blood against his will, he would bind fate to his own advantage. It was a gamble masked as dark confidence, but it was grounded in calculation. He thought he was stealing Harry's greatest shield, Lily Potter's sacrificial protection. The flesh of the servant completed the triangle of sacrifice. Pettigrew offered his own hand without hesitation. It was perhaps the only moment in the whole saga where his devotion overshadowed his fear. Voldemort demanded flesh, and Pettigrew submitted, hoping that loyalty would at last erase his years of cowardice. His scream echoed through the graveyard as the knife fell. It was a terrible, irreversible act, the kind that villains sometimes perform, not because they are brave, but because they no longer have any other path left. The ritual took not only his hand, but any remaining illusion that he might return to the safety of mediocrity. When Voldemort emerged from the cauldron, reborn in a fully formed body, it marked a turning point where darkness temporarily eclipsed light. He rose with the confidence of someone who believed he had reshaped destiny. "I can touch you now," he whispered later to Harry, a chilling declaration that the protection which once forbade him from contact had been undone. Harry felt the truth in those words. The Dark Lord's touch had changed. Voldemort believed the spell had delivered the ultimate victory, immunity from Lily, sacrifice, and the destruction of the barrier that once saved Harry's life. The ritual also revealed how effectively Voldemort manipulated the fear and loyalty of his followers. Upon his rebirth, he summoned the Death Eaters, chastising them for their years of absence, but welcoming them back into his service. It was a psychological trap as well as a magical one. He needed them to witness his return, to see the proof of his power. The graveyard became a stage on which villains reclaimed the narrative, while heroes remained unaware of the danger gathering around them. Voldemort forced his followers to kneel, binding them with guilt, shame, and renewed devotion. Pettigrew, though mutilated, was rewarded with a silver hand, a symbol of loyalty forged in cruelty. In this moment, Voldemort demonstrated that his strategic mind had not weakened during exile. He had chosen the Triwizard Tournament as the perfect opportunity to isolate Harry, sending Barty Crouch Jr. disguised as Alastor Moody to guide events from within Hogwarts. Every challenge Harry faced in the tournament, the dragons, the lake, the maze, was part of a larger deception. Crouch manipulated the Goblet of Fire, the judges, the tasks, and even the portkey that transported Harry to the graveyard. It was a masterclass in infiltration. Heroes believed they were protecting Harry, but villains were already orchestrating the final scene. Number 17, the occupation of the Ministry. The quiet fall of the Ministry of Magic remains one of the most chilling demonstrations of strategic brilliance in the wizarding world. It serves as a rare moment when the villains did not merely strike with brute force, but executed a subtle conquest that left even the wisest witches and wizards disoriented. At a time when everyone feared an open assault by Voldemort's followers, no one expected that the takeover would begin in silence, through whispers, enchantments, and infiltration. What made the event unforgettable was not the violence itself, but the realization that it had happened long before anyone understood they had already lost. The first decisive step was the placement of Pius Thickness at the top of the Ministry's hierarchy. His name had appeared frequently in newspapers as a respected official, a man whose administrative career seemed built on loyalty and competence. Yet Voldemort used that reputation like a mask. Pius was subjected to the Imperious Curse, a spell that transformed him from a bureaucrat to a puppet. The takeover did not begin with a duel. It began with a single mind stolen. Rowling illustrates this shift chillingly when she writes, "Thickness's voice was high and cold, and there was no mistaking the shadow that lay behind his eyes." This detail, subtle and almost easy to overlook, was the harbinger of a silent revolution. By the time the Order of the Phoenix began questioning whether the Ministry had been compromised, Voldemort's network had already filled every vulnerable corridor. The Death Eaters did not storm the building, they simply walked in wearing familiar faces and carrying falsified authority. Dolores Umbridge, whose cruel ambition made her a natural ally, embraced the new order with frightening comfort. Her infamous proclamation, "Magic is might," etched into the towering stone relief behind the minister. His podium was a symbolic announcement that the ministry's purpose had changed. Without a single public duel, the villains had reshaped the government into a machinery of fear. The new ministry shifted from protecting witches and wizards to categorizing them. Under Umbridge's control, the Muggle-born Registration Commission became the heart of a systematic persecution. Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves labeled as imposters. Rowling captures the brutality in a haunting passage, describing a terrified Muggle-born witch trembling before a panel that had already condemned her. She sobbed as the quill scratched the parchment, recording yet another name that the ministry had decided did not deserve magic. No curse could have caused more harm than the power of a corrupted institution. The speed with which Voldemort's ideology flooded the ministry revealed why heroes were so unprepared. They had expected dramatic clashes between the Order and the Death Eaters, not a legislative assault disguised as governance. Just as Grindelwald once manipulated law with charm and charisma, Voldemort manipulated it with stealth and fear. Even the most skilled Aurors were caught off guard because they were trained to fight threats they could see, not political shadows that moved behind closed doors. That, perhaps, was the Dark Lord. His greatest advantage. He attacked the wizarding world as courage, not its magical defenses. Every victory for the villains came from weaponizing ordinary procedures. Ministry memos, once harmless paper airplanes drifting through the air, now carried orders capable of destroying lives. Work desks, filing cabinets, and enchanted elevators became channels for fear. Voldemort had turned the ministry into a fortress without needing to cast protective enchantments himself. When the heroes finally recognized this, when Arthur Weasley whispered to his family that things were worse than anyone could have imagined, the truth was unmistakable. The battle had been lost long before anyone raised a wand. The symbolism of Voldemort taking over the ministry without public confrontation cannot be overstated. He understood that an institution is more powerful than any spell because it dictates how people live, think, and obey. When fear is issued through official memos rather than shouted by masked Death Eaters, it becomes harder to resist. A spell can be countered. A law, however, spreads through society like a poison disguised as order. This was why the heroes found themselves cornered without ever entering a battlefield. Even Hogwarts, once considered the safest place in Britain, fell under the long shadow of the ministry influence. The appointment of Severus Snape as headmaster, supported by ministry decree, showed how deeply Voldemort's control extended. His regime did not require burning down the castle or attacking professors. Instead, it installed authority figures who enforced loyalty through intimidation, such as Amicus and Electo Caro. Students whispered that the halls no longer echoed with learning, but with the threat of punishment. What Voldemort achieved through the ministry was far-reaching. he redefined what normal looked like. Harry, Ron, and Hermione realized how severe the situation had become only when they infiltrated the Ministry using Polyjuice Potion. What they found inside was not chaos, but chilling efficiency. Workers moved with an unnatural sense of caution, as though every quill had eyes and every portrait had ears. The trio witnessed Umbridge wearing Mad Eye Moody, his magical eye, as a trophy, using it to surveil her subordinates. It was a grotesque reminder that the villains did not merely want power, they wanted to erase all symbols of resistance. Rowling writes, "She looked down at them from her perch with the cold triumph of a hunter who believes every creature below her has already been caught. At that moment, the heroes understood that they were not infiltrating a building, but an entire corrupted system." Number 18, The Trap at the Lovegood's house. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stepped onto the frozen path leading to the Lovegood house, believing, for the first time in many hard weeks, that they might receive real help. They had followed clues, argued over theories about the Deathly Hallows, and clung to the hope that Xenophilius Lovegood, with his obsession for strange truths, would offer guidance. The journey to his home felt like a step toward clarity, but beneath that snowy stillness lay a trap, quietly set long before the trio's arrival. Voldemort, who had grown impatient with dissent, had already struck where it hurt most. He had taken Luna. Her absence was not simply a kidnapping, it was the string that tugged the entire situation into darkness. Xenophilius knew he was being watched. Every step he took, every word he spoke, carried the weight of a father terrified of losing the only person left who anchored him to sanity. Inside the Lovegood home, the familiar eccentricity, odd decorations, floating prints of imaginary creatures, felt wrong in a way the trio couldn't yet name. Xenophilius was anxious, panicked, and unable to hide the trembling in his hands as he moved around them. The book describes his demeanor with unsettling precision when it notes that Xenophilius looked frightened, distracted, and strangely brittle, as though one wrong question might cause him to crack. That crack had already happened in his heart. Voldemort. Forces knew the emotional vulnerabilities of their opponents, and Luna was the perfect leverage. For months, Xenophilius had been torn between loyalty to the truth he published in the Quibbler and the overwhelming dread of his daughter's fate. By the time Harry and his friends arrived, he was already conquered in spirit. Xenophilius attempted to maintain a facade of hospitality, but every gesture betrayed a man living under threat. He offered explanations that did not explain and comfort that did not comfort. Hermione sensed the tension first, noticing the darting eyes and the strained way he talked about Luna, his absence. The trio tried to convince themselves that he was simply distraught, but fear has a way of twisting even the most loving heart into something dangerous. Voldemort's manipulation had worked. Xenophilius was preparing to betray them, not out of malice, but desperation. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had fought Death Eaters, oppressive laws, and ancient curses, yet the most devastating blow came from the realization that good people could be turned into unwilling weapons. When Xenophilius made his choice, it was not a sudden moment, but a culmination of grief. He sent the signal that summoned the Death Eaters to his home, hoping the act would purchase Luna's life. The trap was laid silently, its success relying entirely on the trio's belief that they were in friendly territory. Xenophilius knew he was risking the lives of the very people his daughter admired, and that knowledge tormented him. The text captures his turmoil when it says he looked as though each word cost him tremendous effort. He had become a prisoner in his own house, forced into treachery by forces far more ruthless than he had ever imagined. Voldemort's cruelty lay not only in violence, but in turning love into a weapon. As Harry explored the upper floor, the truth revealed itself in Luna's untouched room. Dust lay thick on her belongings, her clothes remained neatly folded, and the signs of months without her presence were undeniable. The description in the book is chilling in its simplicity. There was no clutter, no mess, no sign of recent life. In that moment, the trio understood the full horror of what had been done. Luna had been stolen, hidden away at Malfoy Manor, where cruelty had become sport. The realization that they had walked willingly into a house under surveillance came too late. Harry felt the creeping weight of dread as he heard the unnatural noises from downstairs. Xenophilius had acted, and the Death Eaters were already closing in. The trio found themselves trapped in a home that was collapsing into betrayal. The ground trembled as the Death Eaters attempted to break in, and in the panic, Harry saw Xenophilius, face twisted with a mix of shame and determination. He truly believed he had no choice. Voldemort's forces had ensured that any attempt at resistance would doom his daughter. The cruelty of this tactic shook Harry more deeply than the threat of capture. Throughout the series, the line between good and evil is stark, but here, in this fragile moment, it blurred. Heroes could be forced into villainy, not because they chose darkness, but because darkness cornered them. With the house surrounded, Ron and Harry attempted to defend themselves, but their effort felt futile. The Death Eaters were prepared, coordinated, and confident in their advantage. One of the most unsettling lines from the chapter underscores how close Voldemort was to victory. For a split second, Harry thought they were done for. That moment of near defeat was more than a physical danger. It was a psychological blow. The trio realized that the enemy was adapting, learning, and becoming even more merciless. Voldemort no longer relied solely on brute force. He was now striking at emotional bonds, turning fear into chains. Hermione's quick thinking became the trio's salvation. She conjured a burst of chaotic defensive magic so powerful that it tore the room apart, scattering fragments and confusion in every direction. It was an act of desperation, not precision, fueled by pure survival instinct. The house, already unstable, erupted into a storm of dust and collapsing structure. Hermione's spell created just enough chaos for the trio to escape by disapparition. The book describes the scene as a violent implosion of color and sound, capturing the raw terror of the moment. Hermione's courage did not erase the consequences of what had happened, but it gave them a chance to flee a trap designed with frightening intelligence. The collapse of the Lovegood house served as a metaphor for something larger, the collapse of safety. The trio understood that if even the kind and harmless Xenophilius could be coerced into betraying them, then no ally was truly secure. Voldemort had shifted the rules of engagement. Instead of attacking armies, he attacked families. Instead of destroying homes, he exploited them. This tactic reached beyond strategy. It was psychological warfare. Harry, who had always relied on the loyalty of those around him, realized that this war would test not only strength, but trust. In their escape, the trio carried more than physical injuries. They carried the knowledge that their enemies were now attacking the emotional foundations of the resistance. Xenophilius was not the only parent vulnerable to threats. Many in the wizarding world had already lost children, spouses, or friends. Voldemort's growing domination thrived on fear, and fear spreads faster than dark marks in the sky. The trio knew that this incident would send ripples through the underground networks, making allies more hesitant, more secretive, more afraid to offer help. One man's forced betrayal threatened to fracture the fragile unity of the resistance. The psychological blow became even clearer when Harry recalled how Voldemort had manipulated people before, through promises, threats, and illusions, but this was the first time such manipulation struck so close to their personal journey. The trap set at the Lovegood house was not only a tactical ambush, but a message. Voldemort was willing to exploit innocence. Luna, the gentle girl who believed in imaginary creatures and spoke with kindness to everyone, had become a hostage in a political war she never chose. Her father, a dreamer and eccentric, had been forced to break the trust of the very heroes she supported. Evil had not only infiltrated homes, it had corrupted hope. Hermione, always the voice of reason, understood immediately that the event would haunt Xenophilius forever. She knew he had not acted out of betrayal, but coercion. Yet the reality remained. Their trust had been violated, and the enemy had gained valuable insight into their vulnerability. The trio discussed this silently in their thoughts, each understanding that grief and desperation could turn even the bravest allies into unwilling pawns. This knowledge weighed heavily on them, shaping the decisions they made afterward, making them more cautious, more isolated, and more aware of the stakes. Ron, who often reacted with anger when faced with treachery, found no place for anger now. He had seen the fear in Xenophilius' eyes, the raw panic of a father whose daughter's life was hanging by a thread. Instead of bitterness, Ron felt a deep unease. If his own family were threatened, could he swear he would not make the same choice? The moment forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty and love. Voldemort's strength lay not just in magic, but in understanding how deeply people loved and how that love could be twisted. Harry felt the impact with even greater force. He had long believed in the moral certainty of right and wrong. The Lovegood incident shattered that simplicity. He recognized that this war was not a battle of wands, but of hearts. The quote from the book, "Love is more powerful than any magic," no longer felt purely comforting. In the wrong hands, love could become a chain. Voldemort had turned something pure into something dangerous, and Harry understood that this was a corruption more horrifying than any curse. Hermione later reflected that if not for her magic, the trio would have been captured, and the war might have taken a tragic turn. Her spell was not merely a display of skill, it symbolized the resilience that Voldemort had underestimated. Even when surrounded, even when betrayed, even when hope faltered, they found strength in their unity. The Lovegood trap demonstrated the fragility of their situation, but it also revealed the trio's capacity to adapt, think under pressure, and survive. In the weeks that followed, the trio spoke little about the event, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too painful. The memory of the collapsing house, the sight of Luna's empty room, the sound of Death Eaters circling like vultures, all lingered in their minds. The moment had become a turning point, a reminder that Voldemort had abandoned any remaining semblance of restraint. He was no longer content with fear. He wanted despair. He wanted the resistance to crumble from within. The Lovegood incident became one of the clearest demonstrations of how Voldemort's war strategy evolved into something far darker. It was a moment when evil did not simply attack, it manipulated, corrupted, and coerced. The trio escaped physically, but emotionally they carried the scars. The trap in the Lovegood home was not just an ambush, it was a revelation. It showed that villainy was no longer confined to overt attacks, but had seeped quietly into the intimate spaces of people's lives. It was one of the rare times the villains truly outmaneuvered the heroes, and it reminded them and the entire resistance that no one, not even the kind-hearted Lovegoods, was safe anymore. Number 19, Professor Quirrell and the chess game in the shadows. Professor Quirrell's presence during Harry's first year at Hogwarts often feels like a background detail. An anxious man with a trembling voice, forever smelling faintly of garlic. Yet behind this facade lay one of the most dangerous infiltrations the wizarding world had seen since Voldemort's fall. The quiet professor, hiding in plain sight, demonstrated that evil rarely storms through the front gates. Instead, it slips through unnoticed hallways disguised as harmlessness. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sensed pieces of the truth, but Quirrell's deception was so masterfully woven that even Albus Dumbledore, with all his foresight, momentarily underestimated the threat breathing the same castle air as his students. From the earliest days of the school year, Quirrell's behavior was a riddle wrapped in timidity. Harry remembered the professor stuttered greeting during the ceremony, and later noted how the man gave him a fleeting, frightened look during breakfast. Yet this fear was a performance. Voldemort, clinging like a parasite to the back of Quirrell's head, fed on the professor's ambitions and moulded him into a weapon. While Quirrell taught defense against the dark arts with shaky hands, he quietly crafted obstacles beneath the school surface. When Hagrid retrieved the small, wrapped package from Gringotts, later revealed to contain the Philosopher's Stone, Quirrell was already calculating how to steal it, using the chaos of Hogwarts as camouflage. The Halloween troll incident stands as one of the earliest and most chilling examples of this manipulation. The announcement of the troll in the dungeons sent students fleeing and teachers scattering in panic. But in truth, the troll was not a wild intrusion. It was deliberately planted. Quirrell later admitted, "I let the troll in. I thought it would distract you." His plan was to remove Dumbledore and every teacher from key corridors long enough to attempt access to the stone's protections. Yet even more alarming was how close this plot came to achieving two goals at once: obtaining the stone, testing the reactions of Harry and his friends. The children survived by luck, bravery, and Hermione's quick mind, but few realized then that this terrifying night was orchestrated by someone sitting at the head table every evening. As the year unfolded, Quirrell manipulated Hogwarts not by brute force, but by exploiting the castle as rhythms. He befriended no one, left almost no trace of his true activities, and masked Voldemort's presence with a theatrical meekness that made the staff view him as a nuisance rather than a threat. This disguise worked because it played into expectation. A villain, one might assume, would be bold or visibly cruel, but Quirrell's brilliance lay in turning weakness into armor. Even Hermione, usually perceptive, never suspected him, focusing instead on Severus Snape, whose intimidating demeanor made him the perfect decoy in their eyes. Snape's involvement, or rather, His unfortunate personality became one of Voldemort's greatest unintentional assets. During Harry's first Quidditch match, Snape's intense stare and whispered countercurse made him appear to be the saboteur. The truth was that Quirrell was the one cursing Harry as Broom. As Harry later learned, Snape was trying to save me, chanting a protective spell to keep Quirrell's magic at bay. This is where Quirrell's manipulation reached its peak. He shaped the narrative through behavior alone. He played the coward so convincingly that the trio never questioned his innocence. Meanwhile, he weaponized Snape's bitterness, allowing suspicion to cling naturally into the potion's master like dust to dark robes. Another layer of complexity emerges when examining Dumbledore's role. Though often portrayed as all-knowing, he could not be everywhere at once, nor could he monitor every shifting emotion within Hogwarts. Quirrell and Voldemort used this to their advantage. They acted in moments when Dumbledore was absent, away on school matters or seated far across the Great Hall. The headmaster himself later admitted that the enchantments guarding the stone were designed not to expose the intruder, but to stall him. The protections, Fluffy's trapdoor, Sprout's devil's snare, Flitwick's flying keys, McGonagall's enchanted chessboard, Quirrell's troll, and Snape's logic puzzle were challenges meant for highly capable witches and wizards. Yet Voldemort, even in a weakened state, had centuries of knowledge, and Quirrell himself possessed ambition that overpowered caution. The enchanted chessboard, McGonagall's masterpiece, deserved particular attention in this web of deception. The board was immense, carved from stone and fiercely loyal to its rules. But what made it remarkable in this story was not only its difficulty, it was how Quirrell used the earlier chess lesson to study Harry's strengths. Ron Weasley, the trio strategist, had displayed tactical brilliance in a Hogwarts chess club match, which Quirrell had quietly observed from a distance. The professor realized that if the children ever attempted to stop him, they would likely confront the chess challenge with surprising competence. Thus, he ensured that he reached the stone chamber long before they did, relying on the very arrogance of adults who believed students couldn't possibly breach the protections. Throughout these months, the manipulation extended far beyond trickery. It shaped Harry's understanding of Voldemort. When Harry faced Quirrell in the final chamber, he discovered how deeply he had been deceived. Quirrell's voice was suddenly confident, sharp, and cold, so unlike the frail stutter he had maintained for a year. "I was never alone," he declared, while unveiling the truth about his master. This shift was designed not only to intimidate Harry, but to expose him to Voldemort's psychological warfare. For the first time, Harry realized that evil could wear many masks and that kindness or fear could be counterfeits forged with precision. The moment Quirrell removed his turban was one of the most horrifying revelations of Harry's young life. The face of Voldemort, pale and thin, with gleaming red eyes, whispered from the back of Quirrell's head. It was not merely a grotesque image, it symbolized how close danger had been all along. Voldemort had listened to every word spoken in class, stood only a few feet from Harry at meals, and observed him silently from behind a trembling host. This closeness intensified the understanding that the Dark Lord influence didn't require an army or spells of fire. Sometimes it required only a frightened wizard who surrendered his morality in exchange for power. The chess motif becomes even more meaningful when viewed through this lens. Throughout the book, Ron tried teaching Harry that Chess was all about thinking ahead. Voldemort understood this deeply. His game was not confined to a stone chamber beneath Hogwarts. It was psychological, strategic, and invisible. The troll, the cursed broomstick, the forest detentions, each event functioned like a calculated move on a board whose pieces didn't even know they were being pushed. Harry, Hermione, and Ron reacted bravely, but they were reacting. Voldemort and Quirrell acted first, influencing the flow of events long before the children recognized a pattern. Quirrell's most dangerous weapon was not dark magic, but silence. A quiet presence does not raise alarms, and the mind fills gaps with assumptions. In the trio's case, those assumptions pointed toward Snape, because Snape fit the image of a villain, brooding, rigid, perpetually scowling. This is precisely why Quirrell's deception feels so significant. It teaches young readers, and perhaps young Harry himself, that evil rarely presents itself in familiar shapes. It chooses subtlety over spectacle, patience over fury. Voldemort's possession of Quirrell was the ultimate example of how corruption grows unnoticed, feeding on ambition, until the host no longer resembles the person they once were. Even Dumbledore, despite his wisdom, recognized the painful truth: Hogwarts was not impenetrable. Its protections were crafted by some of the greatest minds in the wizarding world, yet they could not anticipate every strategy. Voldemort exploited the human weaknesses of the castle. His inhabitants' trust, assumptions, overconfidence. This forced Harry to mature early, understanding that danger could hide in robes. As humble as Quirrell, it was a lesson more impactful than any spell taught during that year. When Harry touched Quirrell and saw him crumble into ash, he was not merely defeating an enemy, he was confronting the outcome of deception. Voldemort left Quirrell dying, abandoning him without hesitation. The sight carved itself into Harry's memory. It revealed that the Dark Lord valued servants only as long as they were useful. Quirrell, his loyalty, his sacrifices, and his moral surrender meant nothing the moment he failed. This betrayal showcased another layer of villainy, manipulation from within, the destruction of one's identity in service to a master who offers nothing in return. What makes this entire episode so striking is how close Voldemort came to succeeding. He infiltrated Hogwarts, manipulated events, and reached the Stone A's chamber before anyone realized the full extent of the danger. His schemes nearly unfolded while teachers debated mundane matters and students enjoyed feasts in the Great Hall. It was only through the unexpected resilience of 3 first years that the plan collapsed. Even then, Voldemort escaped, proving that his influence would linger over Harry, his life, and the wizarding world far beyond that moment. The first-year confrontation between Harry and Voldemort was more than a battle for the Philosopher's Stone. It was Harry's introduction into the kind of enemy he faced, an enemy who plans quietly, strikes indirectly, and uses the unlikeliest masks. Quirrell, with his nervous glances and trembling hands, was the perfect illusion. Voldemort weaponized innocence, making the danger invisible until it stood directly before Harry, breathing cold air onto his face. This early test shaped Harry's instincts for years to come, teaching him that vigilance must remain sharp, even in places that seem safe. And although he emerged victorious, the memory of Quirrell's deception became a lasting reminder that in the wizarding world, shadows move long before they are seen. Number 20, Mundungus Fletcher, Betrayal. Mundungus Fletcher has always drifted at the edge of the wizarding world like a stubborn shadow that refuses to be chased away. He was tolerated rather than trusted, included rather than embraced, and watched more carefully than he ever realized. Yet no one in the Order of the Phoenix could suspect that this eccentric collector of dubious trinkets would become the small crack through which Voldemort would wedge his triumph. His betrayal during the operation known as the Seven Potters was not an act of brilliance but of fear, weakness, and that familiar instinct for self-preservation that defined all his choices. The consequences turned a chaotic night into a tragedy, reminding everyone that sometimes the enemy does not break in through strength, but slips in through negligence. The plan to move Harry from Privet Drive was bold and desperate, relying on deception, polyjuice, and trust. 6 members of the Order transformed into Harry image, each escorted by a protector, creating 7 identical targets meant to confuse and disperse any ambush. It was a strategy born out of experience. Voldemort had long pursued the boy, and they expected interference. But the brilliance of the plan was also its vulnerability. It required an absolute unity of purpose, an unbroken chain of secrecy, and a commitment from every participant to place duty above fear. In this fragile web, Mundungus Fletcher was a frayed thread, and no one had noticed how thin it had become. What made his betrayal so devastating was its simplicity. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of magical coercion. He whispered information in exchange for safety, confirming details Voldemort or spies could not obtain any other way. According to the narrative in the 7th book, Harry eventually recalls how Snape, trying to protect Harry, overheard Mundungus being threatened, but the damage had been done earlier. The Death Eaters did not need to guess the route or guess the timing. Their prey had been neatly labelled for them by someone who wore the Order badge but never carried its burden. It was a reminder that Voldemort, as much as he relied on brute force, also understood frailty and exploited it. The night sky over Little Whinging became a battlefield within seconds. Harry describes the chaos vividly. Suddenly, as though the darkness had been split, jets of green light were streaking across the sky. The Death Eaters appeared in formation, not scattered or hesitant, but coordinated with chilling precision. They knew exactly where to strike. Nothing in the scene felt accidental. The ambush had been designed with one goal: isolate the real Harry. Even Hagrid, strong as he was and astride the flying motorbike, could not keep Harry safe from the relentless pursuit that followed. The certainty with which the attackers moved confirmed the awful truth: the enemy was informed. The death of Alastor Mad-Eye Moody remains one of the most painful losses of that night. Moody was the embodiment of constant vigilance, a veteran of 2 wars, a mentor, a guardian. That such a wizard could fall in the opening seconds of an operation he helped design was almost unthinkable. His fall demonstrated how effectively the trap had been prepared. The Death Eaters were already in the sky, already in position, already armed with a strategy meant to overwhelm rather than chase. It is impossible not to connect that precision to Mundungus, its loose tongue. Moody's end was not the result of bad luck, but the direct echo of betrayal. The ambush's cruelty reached an even more personal note when George Weasley was struck by Sectum Sempra, a curse Snape once created as a student. Harry recalls the moment in grim detail. There was a great splash of blood, and George collapsed in the sidecar. The joke-loving, inseparable twin lost an ear, and the Weasley family lost a piece of their joy forever. Although George survived the symbolic violence of injuring one of the twins, icons of light, humor, and resistance, was profound. The tragedy highlighted that Voldemort's forces were not merely attacking a convoy, they were dismantling the emotional pillars of the resistance. Mundungus, his absence during the battle, his cowardly disapparition, only deepened the blow. He fled the moment danger appeared, abandoning Moody, abandoning the plan, abandoning the very people who once vouched for him when no one else would. Harry later reveals the emotional weight of this act when he remembers how the Order reacted to the news. It was not simply anger or disappointment. It was the heavy, suffocating understanding that Moody might have been alive had Mundungus held his ground for even a few seconds longer. His flight was not self-defense. It was the final confirmation that the Order had led a fox into the henhouse. What makes Mundungus' betrayal particularly compelling is that it was not driven by ideology. He didn't believe in Voldemort's philosophy, nor did he seek power or revenge. His treachery was the smallest kind, a coward's attempt to avoid personal harm. Voldemort recognized this kind of vulnerability instantly. He had always known that fear is the most reliable form of control. As Dumbledore once said, Voldemort's gift for spreading fear and discord is very great. He did not need loyalty. He needed cracks, and Mundungus was an open fracture. The Dark Lord played him the way a master strategist maneuvers a pawn, using his panic as both weapon and shield. The shape-shifting deception of the 7 Potters had been designed to confuse Voldemort, but ironically, it was the Order that experienced confusion first. As spells exploded through the air and broomsticks spun wildly, the emotional chaos overtook the tactical structure of the mission. Harry recognized this shift, recalling that every decision in that moment became a gamble rather than a strategy. This breakdown of cohesion proved Voldemort had hit not just their bodies, but their unity. Even the cleverest plans become brittle when trust has been quietly severed beforehand. In the days that followed, the survivors of the battle struggled with grief and the hollow sense of being hunted even in their safest moments. The episode made them re-evaluate everything they believed about loyalty. It was easier to understand how giants, werewolves, and even former allies had previously been swayed by Voldemort. The Dark Lord's power did not lie solely in spells or terror. It lay in the way he made people choose between their lives and their integrity. Mundungus, with his shabby coat and pockets full of stolen goods, became the proof that even the humblest member could tip the scales. Harry himself internalized the lesson with painful clarity. Though he had witnessed betrayal before, from Quirrell, from Pettigrew, from Barty Crouch Jr., this time it struck at his personal circle. Someone who had eaten at the same table, who had been protected by the same networks, had allowed fear to triumph over loyalty. As Harry later thinks about Moody, he cannot help recalling the man's famous mantra. Constant vigilance had not been enough, because vigilance applies only to enemies, not to those within the ranks. Moody had never imagined he could be undone, not by an ambush, but by a deserter. The Order's reaction to Mundungus, once they discovered the full truth, was a mixture of disgust and resignation. No punishment could restore the dead, no outrage could reattach George's ear, and no interrogation could reveal a noble intention where none existed. The tragedy lay in the fact that Mundungus was not extraordinary. He was painfully ordinary. His failure was the type that any organization must fear, weakness rather than malice. Voldemort had succeeded not because his army was stronger, but because he recognized which link in the chain would snap under pressure. In the broader narrative of the Wizarding War, Mundungus's betrayal stands as one of the clearest examples of how villains sometimes outmaneuver heroes, not by genius, but by exploiting neglected vulnerabilities. The Order had underestimated the importance of internal discipline. They assumed danger would arrive through dark magic or direct confrontation. Instead, it arrived through a whisper, a nervous glance, a trembling man who lacked the courage to protect the people who had once protected him. Voldemort, far from being a brute, demonstrated strategic insight worthy of a military commander. The Night of the Seven Potters became a turning point, not only because of the casualties, but because it revealed a chilling truth Voldemort had learned. He had grown more calculating, more perceptive, and far more willing to use psychological warfare. He understood that breaking trust inflicted deeper wounds than breaking bone. His manipulation of Mundungus proved that dark wizards do not need prophecies or grand spells to win. Sometimes a frightened man is enough. It was a revelation that haunted the Order for the rest of the war. Ultimately, Mundungus Fletcher lives in the shadows of the story, not as a mastermind, but as a cautionary tale. His betrayal remains one of the clearest reminders that even the bravest armies can fall when they carry weakness within them. Voldemort had seen the flaw the heroes refused to acknowledge, and by exploiting it, he turned a clever rescue mission into a night of loss. Harry, forever shaped by those events, would later understand that every victory requires more than courage. It requires trust, loyalty, and the painful awareness that sometimes villains win, not because they are stronger, but because heroes overlook the smallest piece on the board. Number 21, the attack on Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. The attack on Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became one of those moments in the Wizarding War when the villains outplayed the heroes, not through brute force, but through unsettling psychological precision. For months, Harry Potter had been slipping further beyond Voldemort's immediate reach. He vanished from Hogwarts, ignored the Ministry, and moved like a shadow across the countryside. Voldemort understood that directly capturing Harry had become too costly and unpredictable. Instead, he sought to carve through the emotional armor surrounding the boy who lived. Among those closest to Harry were Fred and George Weasley, whose shop in Diagon Alley had become a symbol of resilience, joy, and rebellion. Targeting them was a cold, strategic gesture meant to send a message sharper than any curse. The shop itself was never just a business. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes had been born out of defiance. Fred and George had stormed out of Hogwarts in a blaze of fireworks and colour, declaring their independence from Dolores Umbridge and everything she stood for. Their storefront became a beacon in a bleakening world. Even in Half-Blood Prince, J.K., Rowling describes the shop's energy with vivid excitement. The whole place was alive with colour and sound, and the customers were flooding in as though desperate for a last laugh before the end of the world. That atmosphere of joy was precisely why Voldemort struck. He did not need to destroy the building completely. He needed only to poison what it represented. People often forget how vulnerable Diagon Alley had become under the Death Eater's tightening grip. By the time Voldemort's forces initiated their coordinated raids, fear soaked the cobblestones. Auras patrolled in pairs, families appeared only when necessary, moving quickly and with lowered heads. It was in this climate that the Death Eaters struck the Weasley twins' shop not once, but repeatedly, testing the boundaries of order protection and the emotional resolve of those who visited. The attacks were sudden, sharp, and always followed by the same calling card. Nothing stolen, nothing claimed, only destruction. The message was unmistakable. Joy itself was a target. The twins fought back with the same cunning that had helped them build their business. Fred reinforced the windows with anti-blast charms. George designed a network of decoy phantoms that flickered through the shop at random intervals, confusing would-be attackers. Verity, their assistant, learned to move with a wand always in her hand. Yet the Death Eaters were ruthless. They struck during closing hours, long after the lights dimmed, using silent curses meant not to cause injury, but to leave scars, cracked shelves, shattered prototypes, scorch marks on walls. These were signs of intrusion, not conquest. Voldemort wanted the twins to feel watched, hunted, powerless. The emotional blow deepened when one attack left behind the unmistakable remains of crushed, skiving snack boxes, the product Fred considered his masterpiece. To outsiders, this looked like mere vandalism. But to the brothers, this was proof that the enemy understood them intimately enough to desecrate what they held dear. Even Hermione Granger later remarked that the assault was surgical, designed with intimate knowledge of the shop, his interior charms. The implication that someone had studied their defenses, perhaps even observed them in disguise, pushed the twins into a new realm of paranoia. There is a moment recorded in multiple personal accounts of the war when George stood among the ruins of their display shelves and whispered the line that later circulated among the Order. "They were not trying to win, they were trying to break us." That recognition captures the essence of the attack. Voldemort's strategy was not about eliminating physical opponents. It was psychological warfare aimed at the heart of Harry Potter support system. Fred and George, once unstoppable in their mischief, stood visibly shaken, not by fear of death, but by the violation of their sanctuary. The raids also served another strategic purpose. They forced the Order of the Phoenix to stretch its limited resources. Kingsley Shacklebolt, already burdened by Ministry infiltration, had to redirect auras to patrol Diagon Alley more frequently. Remus Lupin volunteered for Night Watch, though he confessed privately that Voldemort never wastes a move. Every guard shift around the shop meant fewer patrols elsewhere. Each attack, even if small, caused a ripple effect of unease and logistical strain that the Order could ill afford. Customers became reluctant to enter the shop, not because they feared Fred and George, but because they feared who might be watching them as they came and went. The shop that once echoed with laughter now trembled under the weight of suspicion. One witness recounted how the extendable ears hanging from the ceiling shivered like leaves in a storm from the residual magic left behind after a late-night raid. Even the famed "you-know-poo" sign flickered unevenly, as if the humor behind it had been dimmed. Voldemort had managed to silence the spirit of rebellion without even appearing in person. The twins' mother, Molly Weasley, suffered deeply from these events. She had always feared for her children, but there was something uniquely cruel in seeing the symbol of Fred and George, his independence, under attack. She begged them to close the shop just temporarily until things calmed down. But Fred and George refused. George later said that surrendering would mean the Death Eaters had succeeded. Fred, ever the bolder twin, reinforced his stance with the simple truth: if we shut down, they win twice. Their bravery became a quiet kind of resistance that inspired many, but it also painted a brighter target on their backs. What made these attacks particularly chilling was that they occurred while Harry remained unaware of them. Busy hunting Horcruxes, Harry could not afford to check on his friends, and Voldemort knew this. The Dark Lord's decision to target the shop was meant as a symbolic reminder that Harry's very existence brought danger to those he loved. It mirrored the earlier tragedy of Dumbledore's army being persecuted, but this time the target was not a hidden school club. It was a thriving, beloved business at the center of wizarding commerce. This was Voldemort's taunt. Harry's sacrifices were not enough. The psychological precision of the attacks becomes clearer when one considers how Voldemort viewed joy and creativity as threats. Fred and George embodied unpredictability, innovation, and a refusal to be intimidated. Their inventions, particularly their portable swamps and magical fireworks, had been used against Death Eater sympathizers before. Suppressing these symbols of resistance was as important to Voldemort as eliminating any strategic stronghold. He wanted the wizarding world to feel that creativity itself was pointless in dark times. One of the most devastating incidents happened when the Death Eaters used fiend fire, controlled just enough not to spread, to burn a jagged scar across the front door. The flame etched the image of a skull without snakes, a crude imitation of the Dark Mark, as if to say, "We do not need to announce ourselves. Our silence is threat enough." When Fred saw it, he stood motionless for several minutes before muttering words, later recalled by Lee Jordan. "They've learned how to strike without showing their faces." This was a turning point. Even the pranksters who had once turned Hogwarts into chaos could no longer laugh off the darkness. Despite all this, the shop never fully closed, but it transformed. The brilliant colors dulled. Certain products disappeared from shelves, either destroyed by raids or pulled back for safety. The once festive atmosphere became subdued, even reverent, as if visitors were stepping into a memorial rather than a joke shop. People spoke quietly. Children clung to their parents. The laughter, when it happened, sounded almost guilty, as though joy was a fragile object that might shatter under the weight of the war. Ironically, the attacks made Weasley's Wizard Wheezes more important symbolically. Just as Grimmauld Place became the secret headquarters of resistance, the shop became the public reminder that the war touched everything: family businesses, friendships, dreams. Voldemort had outmaneuvered the heroes on this battlefield. He turned Fred and George from symbols of rebellion into symbols of vulnerability, effectively communicating that no one, however bright, was beyond his reach. Fred's later death in the Battle of Hogwarts casts a heavy shadow backward over these events. In hindsight, the raids foreshadowed Voldemort's larger intention to fracture the Weasley family and weaken the emotional backbone that held Harry upright. When viewed in this context, the attacks on the shop are not random acts of harassment, but chess moves. Voldemort understood the importance of hearts as well as wands. In attacking the place that represented the Weasley twins' spirit, he carved a wound that would bleed long after the war ended. These raids stand as one of the clearest examples of the Dark Lord's psychological warfare. They were not explosions or fiery battles, they were cold reminders that even laughter could be targeted, even joy could be punished. In this quiet, chilling campaign, the villains outwitted the heroes, not by overpowering them, but by undermining the world they were trying so desperately to protect. Number 22, Caro's Cruciatus Curse on Neville. The corridors of Hogwarts had always held whispers, but during the Caro's regime the whispers turned into tremors of fear that slithered along the stone walls. Neville Longbottom, who once struggled to lift a feather with a levitation charm, walked those corridors as a beacon of stubborn defiance. He had not fled with the others, he had not vanished into safe houses or foreign sanctuaries. Instead, he had remained on the grounds that had shaped him, refusing to surrender the castle to the tyranny of Alecto and Amicus Caro. It was an act so quietly heroic that it irritated the Caros more than open rebellion ever could. Amicus, especially, found himself consumed with the desire to break Neville not through death, but through slow and deliberate psychological unraveling. The Caros understood that to maintain dominance over Hogwarts they needed an example. Neville, who had become the unofficial leader of Dumbledore's army in Harry's absence, represented everything they feared: loyalty, courage, and the kind of hope that spreads like wildfire. The punishments they administered to ordinary students were brutal, but predictable. The punishments reserved for Neville were something else entirely. Methods chosen not only to inflict agony, but to poison the spirits of those who witnessed them. Even students sympathetic to the Death Eaters shuddered at what Amicus was becoming. He had found a canvas in Neville, and the Cruciatus curse was his preferred brush. Neville never forgot the first time Amicus subjected him to the curse in front of a full classroom. The moment Amicus raised his wand, several students gasped, but none dared intervene. Neville braced himself with the haunting memory of Bellatrix Lestrange torturing his parents. He knew exactly what was coming. When the pain crashed through him, it was like fire stitched into his nerves. He heard Amicus sneer, though the words twisted under the waves of agony. The curse was lifted only after Neville collapsed to one knee. Amicus then forced the others to continue their lesson as Neville trembled on the floor. Someone whispered his name, barely audible, but Amicus barked for silence. The message was unmistakable. Bravery would be met with suffering, and compassion would be punished next. Amicus's cruelty was not random. It had the precision of a military tactic. He wanted Neville as pain to serve as a kind of propaganda. The more Neville resisted, the harsher the punishments became, and the more the other students were forced to watch. "You'll do as you are told," Amicus snarled one afternoon, moments before casting the Cruciatus again. Though the books do not detail every instance, they make one truth abundantly clear: the Caros delighted in using forbidden curses. As the narration in the 7th book reminds the reader, there were Caros in the castle now, and they liked punishment. Neville was the embodiment of their frustration, and therefore received their full attention. What the Caros underestimated, however, was Neville's evolving resilience. Pain that might have destroyed another student instead forged him. Each curse taught him how to breathe through torment, how to rise even when every muscle screamed. The more Amicus tried to break him, the more Neville's resolve hardened. Yet victory was not immediate. The Carrows indeed scored temporary triumphs, for fear blossomed among the students like a dark fungus. Younger pupils avoided Neville not out of dislike, but because association with him meant danger. Even friends sometimes flinched when Amicus entered a room, unsure if they would be forced to witness or participate in the next round of cruelty. There were nights when Neville's courage faltered. After particularly harsh sessions, he would retreat into the room of requirement, one of the few places the Death Eaters could not penetrate, and collapse on the cushions that the room provided, as if sensing his exhaustion. Even then, Neville refused to express despair. Instead, he allowed himself silent moments of recovery. He remembered Harry, his determination, Luna's kindness, Hermione's fire, and the sacrifices of his parents. These memories did not erase the pain, but they carved out space for hope. The Carrows had succeeded in terrifying many, but they had failed to extinguish Neville's core identity. One of the most chilling aspects of Amicus, his twisted strategy, was his insistence that the other students watch the curse being performed. Some tried to look away, but Amicus would grab them by the chin and force their eyes open. He wanted them to see a hero brought low, to internalize that their own resistance would be met with equal cruelty. Teacher and torturer became synonymous. Amicus understood what Voldemort had always emphasized: control is most effective when the victim participates in their own subjugation. Voldemort himself once said, "There is nothing worse than death," but he often proved this untrue by showing that there are fates far more horrifying. The Carrows followed that philosophy with zealous devotion. Students who witnessed these events later admitted that Amicus nearly succeeded. Fear spread through the common rooms. Many chose neutrality simply to avoid punishment. Some even parroted Death Eater ideology, though everyone knew it was merely an act of survival. But Neville, despite being the one suffering the most, never asked others to join him. He understood that leadership under oppression required empathy. He bore the brunt of amicus, or torture, not because he sought martyrdom, but because he refused to force another student into harm's way. It is crucial to recall that the Cruciatus curse is not simply physical pain, it targets the mind as well. When Bellatrix had tortured Neville's parents, the result was complete psychological destruction. The Carrows, by repeatedly casting the curse on Neville, demonstrated their intention to replicate that outcome. Yet Neville's mind did not fracture. He learned how to ground himself, sometimes by focusing on a single memory, the day Professor Lupin taught the class how to conjure a Patronus, or the moment Dumbledore gave him points for bravery at the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. These moments anchored him, preventing the curse from hollowing out his identity. Neville's story during this time also includes a revealing example that underscores his endurance. On a February evening, Amicus ordered Neville to demonstrate the Cruciatus on a younger student. Neville refused instantly, and Amicus, enraged, cast the curse with such force that Neville's vision blurred for hours afterward. Several students cried quietly as they watched. This incident, though small in scale, revealed the full psychological tactics of the Carrows. If they could not force him to comply through threats, they would attempt to break him through moral dilemmas. Neville's refusal, even when it cost him dearly, became one of the legends whispered through the hidden tunnels of Hogwarts. Throughout all this, Neville was not entirely alone. Luna Lovegood left encouraging notes tucked under classroom doors. Ginny Weasley coordinated clandestine meetings of the reformed DA. Although they occasionally had to retreat outside the castle, they remained spiritually connected to Neville. Their support reminded him that resistance was never an individual act, even when carried by a single pair of shoulders. Yet the Carrows did not relent. Amicus once cornered Neville outside the Charms classroom and cast the Cruciatus without preamble. Neville screamed, his body contorting, while Alecto lectured the onlookers about the fate of troublemakers. This was the moment when several younger students finally realized the Carrows' true intentions. They were not teachers, they were captors, and Neville was their most symbolic prisoner. Even when the Carrows nearly succeeded in isolating Neville, they could not suppress the elemental truth that Hogwarts itself seemed to protect him. The castle, sensing the injustice within its walls, bent its magic subtly around him. Doors locked themselves behind him when he needed escape. Staircases shifted to carry him away from danger. The room of requirement expanded, providing shelter not only for Neville, but for dozens of students who eventually joined him. Amicus's victory, though substantial, began to crumble the moment students recognized that Neville had become more than a target. He was their rallying point. Hogwarts had always valued courage, but during that grim year, courage looked different. It did not roar. It did not flash like Gryffindor banners. It whispered in Neville's footsteps, in the way he straightened his back, even when the echoes of the Cruciatus still trembled through him. It lingered in his eyes whenever he stood between the Carrows and another student. The Carrows had succeeded in making him suffer, but they had failed to make him surrender. The most haunting line associated with Neville during that period comes not from the Carrows but from the book's narrator, stating simply, "They tortured Neville, trying to break him." That stark sentence encapsulates everything the Carrows hoped to achieve. And for a time, yes, they almost did. They nearly crushed the spirit of Hogwarts. They nearly convinced the students that resistance was pointless. They nearly transformed the castle into a monument of fear rather than learning. But almost is the key word, for tyranny often wins battles while losing the war. When Neville eventually confronted Voldemort in the Great Hall, holding the sword of Gryffindor, the weight of everything he had endured radiated from him like a silent storm. The Carrows' cruelty had shaped him into the person capable of uttering the words, "I'll join you when hell freezes over." He stood there not because he was fearless, but because he had already faced the worst pain imaginable and emerged whole. The Carrows had unintentionally forged a hero in the very process they believed would destroy him. Neville's endurance under the Cruciatus curse remains one of the most striking examples of villains temporarily outwitting heroes. The Carrows exploited fear with meticulous precision, manipulating the psychological landscape of Hogwarts. They nearly turned Neville, suffering, into propaganda for oppression. Their strategy was insidious, calculated, and disturbingly effective, proof that evil does not always rely on grand schemes. Sometimes it thrives in classrooms, in whispered lessons, in the slow erosion of hope. And yet, in their attempt to break one boy, they ignited the rebellion that would ultimately destroy them. Number 23, the trap at Malfoy Manor. The aftermath of the escape from Gringotts did not bring triumph or relief. Instead, it delivered Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger into a storm they could neither predict nor control. The moment they disapparated from the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange, soaked, burned, and exhausted, they had no sense of where they were landing. Their injuries clouded their magic. Their panic blurred their judgment. A single, miscalculated apparition sent them spiraling into danger, far worse than the dragon or the goblin guards they had just fled. They crashed into the outskirts of Malfoy Manor, an estate wrapped in cold white stone and even colder loyalties, a place where misfortune always felt intentional. The trio did not know it yet, but they had fallen directly into the hands of enemies who had been waiting for a stroke of luck, an opportunity to reclaim their favor with Voldemort. This was the moment those enemies had been craving. The snatchers who intercepted them were not the polished aristocratic villains Harry had faced before. They were opportunists, scavengers of the new regime, men like Scabia and Greyback who thrived in the grey zones between authority and savagery. Yet what made this encounter particularly dangerous was not their brutality, but their suspicion. They did not immediately realize whom they had trapped. Hermione had cast a disfiguring curse on Harry, turning his features into a swollen, distorted version of himself. Ron attempted to disguise his identity through fumbling lies about a travelling family, but the Snatchers noticed details, the kind that sharpened their instincts. Harry, his lightning-shaped scar beneath the swelling, the sword they carried, the unusual companions. "He's got the scar!" one of them shouted, their voices swelling into hungry triumph. The quotes in the chapter make clear how quickly the mood shifted, how a moment of uncertainty transformed into the thrill of a captured prize. The villains had not yet outsmarted the heroes, but the trap had begun to tighten. As the Snatchers dragged them through the iron gates of Malfoy Manor, the trio's disorientation deepened. Harry felt the unmistakable chill of a place drenched in dark magic. The manor was not simply a home, it was a symbol of allegiance to Voldemort. Lucius Malfoy's desperation hung in the air. Narcissa Malfoy's fear pulsed beneath the surface. Draco Malfoy's uncertainty flickered like an unsteady flame. But beneath all of this was another force, a strategic cruelty perfected over months of war. Their arrival ignited a surge of opportunity in the hearts of the Malfoys, who saw a potential redemption for their family after a year of failures. The villains were hesitant at first, studying Harry's distorted face, comparing it with the face they remembered from school and memories of humiliation. But then came the pivotal recognition, the sword of Gryffindor. It was impossible to mistake. Bellatrix Lestrange's shrill gasp. "Where did you get that sword?" cracked through the room like a lash. Bellatrix's reaction was not impulsive panic. It was strategic terror. She knew the sword's significance. She understood that someone who possessed it might be attempting to destroy what Voldemort desperately wished to protect. "If this is real," she whispered in the book, trembling with dread she did not acknowledge aloud, "then the Dark Lord must be told." The villains were not behaving as caricatures of evil. They were calculating the implications behind every possibility. Their minds were turning toward Voldemort's growing impatience, his tendency to punish failure, his obsession with the Deathly Hallows and the Horcruxes. Bellatrix recognized that the presence of the sword meant something catastrophic had occurred, something that threatened her position, her prestige, and possibly her life. This fear drove her strategy, and it turned the manor into a psychological trap as deadly as any physical one. Hermione Granger became the primary target of Bellatrix as desperation. The villainess dragged her away not out of personal hatred, though hatred was present, but because Hermione's intelligence was a threat. Torturing her was not meant to break her spirit alone. It was meant to crack open the secret Bellatrix feared most, whether the trio had found the real sword hidden in her vault. Every scream that echoed through the manor was a calculation. Bellatrix needed answers before Voldemort arrived. She wanted to confirm that her treasures, her prestige, her loyalty had not been compromised. Hermione, as pain became a means of extracting that truth. In the book, Harry hears her cries and feels torn between hopelessness and fury, but he is shackled by ropes and wandless. The villains had crafted a situation in which Harry, his strengths, his loyalty, his courage, his instinct to protect, became weapons against him. He was forced to listen, unable to help. What made this moment especially sinister was the patience the villains displayed. They were not rushing, they were assessing. Lucius Malfoy pushed for calling Voldemort immediately, eager to restore his family or honor. Narcissa sought to maintain order. Bellatrix insisted on interrogation first. Each villain acted according to personal motive, but all were united by a single strategic purpose, exploiting the vulnerability of their prisoners before involving their master. The tension grew with every minute. Harry and Ron were thrown into the cellar with Luna Lovegood, Dean Thomas, and the Goblin Griphook. Each of them represented a loose thread in the tapestry of the Resistance, a thread the villains hoped to unravel completely. Harry's panic worsened as he sensed Voldemort growing closer through their mental connection. His mind involuntarily drifted into visions of the Dark Lord traveling across the landscape, leaving ruins behind him, desperate for the Elder Wand. This connection, always dangerous, now became another layer of the trap. Harry felt the villain approaching like a storm cloud, but he could not act. The Death Eaters had outmaneuvered him. Their strategy used time as a weapon. The longer they held him, the closer Voldemort came, and the more inevitable death seemed. In this moment, the villains were not mere enforcers, they were predators playing with the rhythm of fear. The torture of Hermione reached its peak when Bellatrix pressed the blade of her knife against Hermione's skin, carving a word meant to humiliate and brand her. The detail in the book is chilling, the word mudblood etched with deliberate cruelty. Yet even this was part of the larger strategy. Bellatrix wanted Hermione to believe that silence would cost her everything, that resistance was futile, that the cause she fought for was collapsing. The physical pain was horrific, but the psychological torment, forcing Hermione to hold the secret of the real sword while enduring such agony, was what Bellatrix truly relied upon. Hermione refused to break. Her bravery became a silent defiance, but it came at a high cost. Meanwhile, the cellar became a place of frantic hope. Harry desperately pieced together fragments of a plan while the others tried to free themselves from bindings. It was in this moment, perhaps the darkest point of their journey, that an unexpected glimmer appeared, the faint pop of apparition, quiet but unmistakable. Dobby, the house elf, arrived like a whispered miracle. His presence disrupted the villains' perfect strategy. Dobby, once enslaved by the Malfoys, now stood in silent rebellion against them, his magic fueled by loyalty and love for Harry. His ability to bypass magical barriers made him the perfect counter to the villains' carefully built trap. But even Dobby's intervention unfolded under the shadow of the villain's cunning. When Harry and Ron burst into the drawing room to save Hermione and Griphook, chaos erupted. Bellatrix immediately seized Hermione, pressing a knife to her throat, not as a threat born of desperation, but as a calculated move to regain control. The villains still held the advantage. They used Hermione as leverage, knowing Harry would freeze rather than risk her life. For a moment, the heroes' courage became the very chain that bound them. The balance shifted only when Dobby intervened again, causing the chandelier to collapse. The villains were forced into disarray. The heroes scrambled to escape. The final act of the trap came when Bellatrix hurled her dagger with lethal precision. The weapon whirled through the air, not striking Harry or Ron, but striking Dobby, an unexpected target, one the villain had not even intended to harm specifically. The book describes how the dagger seemed to pierce the very air before burying itself into the elf. Even in the moment of losing control, the villains left a final mark of cruelty. The tragedy of Malfoy Manor was not simply that the heroes were captured. It was how completely the villains controlled the narrative. They recognized clues, exploited weaknesses, applied psychological pressure, and used fear as a scalpel. Their plan was not flawless, but it was dangerously effective. Hermione was tortured. Harry was immobilized by fear. Ron was driven to despair. Luna, Dean, and Griphook were powerless. The villains had orchestrated a situation where victory for the heroes was almost impossible. Malfoy Manor demonstrated that evil in the Harry Potter world was not only violent, but intelligent. Bellatrix Lestrange, with her blend of sadism and strategic insight, used fear to fracture the trio's resolve. Lucius Malfoy used ambition to guide his decisions. Greyback used hunger for violence to keep prisoners compliant. Each villain played a part in constructing a trap that nearly succeeded. Harry himself reflected on this later, recognizing how close they had come to failure, how the villains had cornered them in a moment of vulnerability created not by weakness, but by fate. The moment Dobby died in Harry's arms on the beach became the emotional epilogue of this ordeal. It underscored just how devastating the consequences of the villains' strategy had been. Dobby's final words, "Such a beautiful place, to be with friends," reminded Harry that the cost of escaping the trap was not measured in victory, but in sacrifice. The villains had taken something irreplaceable from him. Even in defeat, they left a wound. The events in Malfoy Manor marked one of the few times in the series where the villains genuinely outmaneuvered the heroes. They recognized clues, acted quickly, used psychological pressure, and nearly delivered Harry to Voldemort. Their strategy was not born of brilliance, but of desperation, fear, and ruthless instinct. Yet it was precisely those qualities that made them dangerous. For a brief, terrifying moment, the heroes were pawns in the villains' game. The memory of Hermione's screams, the threat of Voldemort's arrival, and the loss of Dobby shaped the trio's resolve moving forward. The villains had shown that they were not merely threats, they were predators capable of strategic intelligence. Malfoy Manor was the battlefield where evil demonstrated foresight, and the heroes realized that bravery alone would not be enough to win the war. Number 24. The takeover of the Daily Prophet. In the midst of the Second Wizarding War, it was clear that the conflict was far more than a series of battles fought with wands. The war was not only about magical duels and the clash of powerful spells, but also about the control of information. And in the most insidious turn of events, Voldemort, the Dark Lord, understood that better than anyone. In his hands, information became a weapon more potent than any curse, and he seized it with cold precision, turning it into an instrument of terror. One of Voldemort's most cunning moves was the capture of the Daily Prophet, the most influential newspaper in the wizarding world. Under the leadership of the Ministry of Magic, the paper had long served as a reliable source of news and commentary. But when Voldemort took control, the Prophet transformed into a mouthpiece for his regime, a tool that would not only spread his ideology but also sow fear and confusion among the populace. The paper, once a trusted journal, became a propaganda machine. Every issue brimmed with reports that painted Harry Potter and his allies as criminals, rebels, and even threats to the safety of the wizarding community. Albus Dumbledore, once revered as a wise and benevolent figure, was depicted as a manipulator, scheming behind the scenes to orchestrate a war. The image of the kindly old wizard who had mentored generations of students was tarnished, and instead he was vilified as a puppet master whose only goal was to instigate chaos. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was now the poster child for everything Voldemort's followers despised. His name became synonymous with resistance, and not in the heroic sense, but as a symbol of defiance that needed to be eradicated. The most striking feature of Voldemort's campaign, however, was the introduction of the taboo, a dark and insidious spell that served as both a weapon and a tool for surveillance. This spell was so potent that it would immediately alert Death Eaters to anyone who dared to utter Harry Potter's name. A mere whisper of his name and the caster would be marked, and the Death Eaters would be on their trail, ready to strike. The taboo rendered the very mention of Harry Potter dangerous, even deadly. It wasn't just a matter of being overheard by the wrong people, it was a matter of life and death. The consequences of the taboo were devastating. It wasn't merely a spell, it was a form of magical surveillance that hung over the heads of every wizard and witch in the country. The mere thought of speaking Harry's name became a risk, and as a result, the entire community fell into silence. People were no longer free to talk openly about the war, their fears, or their hopes. Even in their own homes, behind closed doors, the taboo reached in and made people think twice before mentioning anything related to the boy who lived. Fear seeped into the very fabric of daily life, and the war was no longer fought just on battlefields, but in the minds of everyone who lived under Voldemort's reign. The Daily Prophet played a pivotal role in this transformation. With its control over the narrative, the paper created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Headlines screamed of the ministry's failures, labeling anyone who opposed Voldemort as a criminal or traitor. The truth was twisted, and the wizarding world was fed a constant diet of lies. People who had once stood for justice and freedom were now forced into the shadows, their names smeared, their motives questioned, and their actions misrepresented. In many ways, the takeover of the Prophet was a stroke of genius. Voldemort understood that if you control the flow of information, you control the very course of history. His victory in the war was not only secured through brute force, but also through the manipulation of perception. The taboo served as a tool of terror, but it was the relentless propaganda of the Daily Prophet that truly solidified Voldemort's grip on power. The people were left to question everything they had once believed in. Were the people they admired truly heroes, or were they part of a grand conspiracy? Were their actions for the greater good, or had they been led astray? But the taboo and the Daily Prophet weren't the only instruments of Voldemort's dominance. In the dark corners of wizarding society, whispers of fear spread like wildfire. Families went quiet, friends grew distant, and neighbors began to eye each other with suspicion. There was a pervasive sense that anyone could be a traitor, anyone could be working with the resistance, and at any moment someone could betray you. And in this world there was no safety, no place to hide, no one could be trusted completely. This was Voldemort's vision of the future, a world where fear permeated every aspect of life. The people of the wizarding world were no longer free to think or speak as they wished. The constant surveillance of the taboo and the malicious reporting of the prophet ensured that Voldemort's enemies were silenced, not just through force, but through the terror of being discovered, of being exposed, of losing everything. Yet, despite the relentless oppression, there was a resistance. Dumbledore's army, the Order of the Phoenix, and other groups refused to bow to Voldemort's will. They fought back against the terror, against the silence, against the suffocating grip of fear that Voldemort had placed on the wizarding world. They didn't just fight with wands, but with their voices, with their ability to resist the propaganda and the lies. They fought to reclaim the truth, to reclaim the ability to speak freely, and to restore the values that had been corrupted by Voldemort's dark reign. Even as the taboo and the Daily Prophet sought to erase him, Harry Potter remained a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for those who dared to believe in the possibility of victory. His name, though cursed by Voldemort, became the rallying cry of a resistance that refused to be silenced. And in the end, it was this defiance that led to Voldemort's downfall. The Dark Lord's reliance on fear, on information, and on control ultimately became his greatest weakness. His grip on the wizarding world may have been powerful, but it was not unbreakable. As Harry, Ron, and Hermione journeyed through the perilous years of war, they encountered the consequences of Voldemort's control at every turn. They saw firsthand the effects of the taboo, the lies spread by the Daily Prophet, and the fear that had become a part of everyday life. But they also saw the courage of those who fought back, of those who refused to let Voldemort's terror define their lives. Through their actions, they proved that even in the darkest of times, the truth cannot be completely extinguished, and the power of resistance will always find a way to survive. The events surrounding the Daily Prophet and the taboo serve as a chilling reminder of the power of information in shaping the course of history. Voldemort may have succeeded in using the press and the magical surveillance to further his agenda, but in the end it was the heroes who won, not through the power of their wands, but through their unwavering commitment to truth, freedom, and justice. The prophet may have been a tool of the Dark Lord, but it was also the place where the seeds of rebellion were planted, and as long as there were those who remembered the truth, Voldemort's dark reign would never last. Number 25. Death Eaters among the teachers. After the fall of the Ministry, Hogwarts became a fortress of fear. Under Voldemort's oppressive rule, the once vibrant school, a symbol of hope and learning, turned into a dark and twisted institution. The students who had once enjoyed the safety of the school now found themselves in the grip of terror, with every hallway echoing whispers of fear. The headmaster was no longer the wise and kind Albus Dumbledore, but Severus Snape, a man whose allegiance was as ambiguous as the shadows that clung to the walls. His rule was harsh, cold, and merciless, but he was not the most dangerous presence at Hogwarts. That dubious honor belonged to the Carrow siblings. Alecto and Amicus Carrow, two Death Eaters who had infiltrated the school, were far more than mere teachers. They were sadists in the truest sense. They were brought into the fold by Voldemort not just for their cruelty, but for their willingness to spread that cruelty among the students, to poison the minds of the next generation. Under their tutelage, Hogwarts was no longer a place for learning. It was a place for fear, manipulation, and indoctrination. The Carrows were not interested in education, they were interested in shaping the young minds of the wizarding world into the twisted ideals of the Dark Lord. The Defense Against the Dark Arts classes, once a space where students learned how to protect themselves from the forces of evil, were turned into something far more sinister. Under Alecto Carrow's guidance, the students were no longer taught how to defend themselves. They were taught how to embrace the dark arts. It was no longer about warding off dark creatures. It was about inflicting pain and suffering. The lessons were cruel and designed to break the spirit. She would go out of her way to make sure the students understood the meaning of fear, often using her own sadistic tendencies to drive the point home. This was no longer a class about defense. It was a class about domination, about taking power by force. Amicus Carrow, meanwhile, was given the task of teaching Muggle studies, but, like his sister, he used his position to spread a message of hate and fear. Where Muggle studies had once been about understanding and learning from the non-magical world, it became a class designed to demean and insult. It was no longer about respect for the differences between magical and non-magical folk. It was about showing the students that Muggles were inferior, that they were subhuman. Amicus used every opportunity to belittle Muggle-borns, to make them feel less than, to ensure that the divide between magical and non-magical bloodlines was reinforced. The Carrows' teaching methods were not just cruel, they were insidious. They were a direct reflection of Voldemort's strategy. He understood that to break a people, you had to start with their children. Hogwarts, once a beacon of light in a dark world, was now a factory for molding new followers of the Dark Lord. By turning the school into a place where hatred, fear, and violence were not only tolerated but encouraged, he ensured that the next generation would grow up with no sense of justice, no moral compass to guide them. The very idea of right and wrong was twisted, warped, and destroyed. The most dangerous part of this plan was not the Carrows themselves, but the atmosphere they created. The students, especially those who had been loyal to Dumbledore, found themselves isolated, ostracized, and outnumbered. The professors who might have stood against the Carrows were either too afraid or had been removed, leaving the Carrows free to spread their venom unchecked. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and their friends were no longer the heroes of Hogwarts. They were fugitives, hunted by the very institution they had once called home. They were forced to operate in the shadows, sneaking around, trying to uncover information to help those they could, but always with the knowledge that they were surrounded by enemies. Voldemort's strategy was cunning in its simplicity. Instead of destroying Hogwarts, he took control of it. He used the school as a weapon, a tool to reshape the wizarding world. By turning the students into tools of the Dark Lord, he ensured that the next generation would be ready to carry out his bidding. He did not need to annihilate Hogwarts, he simply needed to pervert it, to make it a breeding ground for evil. And in this, he succeeded. The students who were once proud to be part of the Hogwarts tradition were now trapped in a nightmare. The effect on the students was profound. Those who were not yet loyal to Voldemort were forced to confront their worst fears. They were subjected to constant threats, physical abuse, and psychological torment. Every day was a battle, not just to survive, but to hold on to their humanity. The Carrows made sure of this. They were not content with simple obedience. They wanted to break the students completely, to turn them into mindless followers of the Dark Lord. The Carrows, like Voldemort, understood the power of fear, and they used it expertly. They knew that if they could destroy the students' sense of hope, if they could make them believe that resistance was futile, they could ensure their loyalty. The students, who had once fought for freedom and justice, now found themselves in a world where those ideals seemed almost impossible to achieve. For Harry and his friends, the reality of the situation was harsh. They had lost their place at Hogwarts, and they were no longer able to fight openly. They had been forced into hiding, unable to return to the school they had once protected. In a way, the Carrows had won. They had succeeded in turning Hogwarts into a place where the heroes were hunted, where the villains were in control. Voldemort's victory was not just a physical one, it was a psychological one. He had turned their safe haven into a place of terror. He had made it so that even the students who had once been brave and bold were now forced to live in fear. But while the Carrows may have been able to control the school for a time, they underestimated the power of the human spirit. Despite the horrors they faced, despite the constant fear and the manipulation, Harry and his friends did not give up. They continued to fight, even in the shadows. They worked in secret, gathering information, spreading resistance, and finding ways to weaken the hold that Voldemort and his followers had on the school. It was a battle that could not be won by force alone. It required courage, unity, and the belief that no matter how dark the world became, there would always be those who would stand up for what was right. In the end, the Carrows, like all who served Voldemort, were doomed to fail. Their twisted vision of the world, built on fear and hate, could not last. The heroes may have lost the battle for Hogwarts at that moment, but the war was far from over. They had been driven out, but their spirit remained unbroken, and in the end, it was that spirit, that refusal to give in to darkness, that would lead to Voldemort's ultimate downfall. The Carrows, for all their cruelty and cunning, could not destroy the one thing that Voldemort had never understood, the power of love, the power of unity, and the power of hope. Number 26. Grindelwald and the lie about the Elder Wand. In the shadowed world of Harry Potter, where the line between good and evil is often blurred, the devious nature of certain characters can be seen in the intricacies of their actions. One of the most cunning acts of deception comes from Gellert Grindelwald, the infamous dark wizard who, despite being imprisoned in Nurmengard at the time, played a pivotal role in manipulating the course of events that would eventually lead to the rise of Lord Voldemort. His involvement in Voldemort's quest for the Deathly Hallows, specifically his role in misleading him about the Elder Wand, showcases an unexpected layer of strategy within the dark side, one that almost went unnoticed by those caught in the web of his lies. At the time Voldemort sought out Grindelwald, the latter had already been incarcerated for years. His reign of terror had ended, and the Dark Lord believed that Grindelwald's knowledge of the Elder Wand would be key to his own rise to power. Voldemort, with his unyielding ambition to dominate the wizarding world, had already slaughtered anyone who stood in his way. Yet there he was, standing before Grindelwald, who remained imprisoned, now a mere relic of his past. Voldemort sought him out not only because of his old reputation, but because of the Elder Wand and significance, a wand that had once belonged to the fabled Death, and that had the power to defeat any opponent. However, when Voldemort asked Grindelwald about the wand's location, he received an answer he wasn't expecting: a lie. Grindelwald, though confined in a high-security prison, still possessed the sharp intellect and devious cunning that had made him a threat to the wizarding world in his youth. He had no reason to help Voldemort directly, nor did he have any intention of handing over the wand location. What Grindelwald knew, and what Voldemort failed to grasp, was the immense psychological game that was being played. By lying about the wand, its whereabouts, Grindelwald set into motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead Voldemort to his doom. It wasn't just a matter of withholding information, it was a deliberate act of misdirection, a careful planting of a false trail that would confuse and ultimately harm Voldemort in the end. The lie that Grindelwald told was deceptively simple. He claimed that the Elder Wand was not in his possession, and that he didn't know where it was. To Voldemort, a dark wizard obsessed with control and power, this response seemed like the ramblings of a defeated man, one who had lost his grip on his former glory. However, Grindelwald's decision to deceive was not out of weakness, but out of pure strategic brilliance. He knew that Voldemort's obsession with the Elder Wand would make him reckless, and that recklessness would be Voldemort's undoing. The genius behind Grindelwald's lie lay in the fact that he had nothing to gain from the situation. The Elder Wand was not in his possession, and at the time it was lost to history. But Grindelwald understood Voldemort's mindset better than anyone. The Dark Lord believed that the wand's power would make him invincible, and he would stop at nothing to possess it. By feeding him false information, Grindelwald set the stage for Voldemort's own downfall. Grindelwald was playing a long game, one that would outlast his own imprisonment and continue to affect the wizarding world long after he had faded into history. Voldemort, for all his intelligence and power, was blinded by his own desires. He could not fathom that Grindelwald, a former ally, would ever lie to him. His obsession with the Elder Wand clouded his judgment, and he allowed himself to be led down the false path Grindelwald had set. Grindelwald's lie led Voldemort to believe that the wand was somewhere else, and this mistaken belief drove him to seek out the wand with reckless abandon. Instead of focusing on finding true power, Voldemort was led to pursue a shadow of it, a pursuit that ultimately weakened his position and made him vulnerable. Grindelwald's act of deception was a brilliant piece of manipulation. In his mind, he was not simply lying to Voldemort, he was playing a game of chess where every move had consequences. By planting the seed of doubt in Voldemort's mind, he forced the Dark Lord into a position of uncertainty. Grindelwald knew that Voldemort, consumed by his obsession with power, would not stop until he found the Elder Wand, no matter the cost. And in that relentless pursuit, Voldemort made crucial mistakes that ultimately led to his downfall. The irony of it all was that Voldemort, who had destroyed so many lives in his quest for domination, was now being outsmarted by the very wizard he had once viewed as a rival. The false trail Grindelwald set also had another layer of depth. By denying knowledge of the Elder Wand as location, Grindelwald directly played into the idea of fate that Voldemort had long subscribed to. Voldemort believed that destiny had chosen him as the one to conquer death and rule the wizarding world. Grindelwald's lie subtly undermined that belief, reminding Voldemort that he was not the all-knowing, all-powerful wizard he thought himself to be. Even the most powerful dark wizard in the world could be manipulated by a well-crafted lie. The consequences of this deception became evident in the final battle between Voldemort and Harry Potter. In his misguided pursuit of the Elder Wand, Voldemort never realized that the true master of the wand was not him, but Harry, who had unknowingly become its rightful owner. Voldemort's failure to understand the true nature of the wand, compounded by Grindelwald's false information, ultimately led to his defeat. The lie that Grindelwald had told, though seemingly insignificant at the time, was the catalyst for Voldemort's downfall. It was a move so subtle, yet so powerful, that it went unnoticed by both Voldemort and Harry until the very end. Voldemort's obsession with the Elder Wand, spurred by Grindelwald's deception, led to the breakdown of his own carefully constructed plans. By believing the false trail that had been set for him, Voldemort's focus shifted away from his true goal of conquering death and solidifying his control over the wizarding world. Instead, he became fixated on a false prize, one that would never be his. The true power of the Elder Wand was not in its ability to make its owner invincible. It was in the understanding that power could be taken away just as easily as it was given. Voldemort's ultimate failure was his inability to recognize this truth. Grindelwald's role in the story of the Elder Wand is a testament to the power of strategic thinking and the subtlety of deception. It was a move that required patience and understanding of the enemy, his mindset. In the end, Grindelwald's lie didn't just mislead Voldemort, it trapped him in a web of his own making. Voldemort's pursuit of the Elder Wand, driven by his own arrogance and obsession, blinded him to the truth. In his relentless desire for power, he fell victim to the very deception that had been carefully crafted for him. And in the end, it was a lie told by a dark wizard who had long since been imprisoned that played a pivotal role in the fall of the most dangerous dark wizard the wizarding world had ever known.